Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media. Welcome to today's webinar on the transport crisis, where a panel of experts will unpack ways of overcoming South Africa's poor rail and logistics performance in an effort to deliver socio-economic development through a stronger transport system. Today's webinar is sponsored by BDO Advisory Services, Woest Alpine VAE South Africa, University of Johannesburg, Nale Technologies, and Scania. We thank them for making this event possible. Before we begin, please be aware that we've enabled the Q&A, so please post any questions there. You'll find the Q&A on the panel at the bottom of your screen. The panelists will try to answer as many of your questions as possible throughout the discussion. To encourage interaction, we've also enabled the chat, so you can network with the panelists via the chat box. You'll also find this at the bottom of your screen. Please remember not to post any questions in the chat, though, as we may miss them. You can post all your questions into the Q&A. Please also be aware that we're recording this webinar and we'll be sending the recording to you when it's available. We're also streaming the webinar live to YouTube, and we'll share the link in the chat shortly. So to get started, I'd like to introduce today's facilitator, Christelle Groman. She's the Director for Strategic Development and Advisory at BDO Advisory Services. She has advised extensively in the tourism, hospitality and leisure, property and infrastructure sectors in her 30-year career. Christelle will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which includes Rudy Dix, who's the head of the Project Management Office in the Private Office of the South African President, Phulani Shabalala Kingston, CEO of Woest Alpine VAE South Africa, Dr. Juanita Marrer, CEO of the Southern Africa Association of Freight Forwarders, and Henk Langenhoven, Chief Economist at Minerals Council South Africa. Just a quick note to advise, however, that Mr. Dix may join the session a little later than planned as he is attending a cabinet meeting. But for now, let's get started. I'll hand over to our facilitator, Christelle Groman, to continue with the proceedings. Over to you, Christelle.
Thank you, Shannon, and welcome everybody, and welcome also to this very strong panel. I must say I'm a little bit, there's no pressure here. I think the good thing is the panel has both public and private sector representation, but what we're looking at today is really trying to see some practical solutions. We know that there has been much spoken about and written about the National Logistics Crisis Committee, where linked to the Operation Vilandlela. There is a lot of plans in place. Where exactly we are with those plans, we hope to speak to Mr. Dix about when he joins us, and maybe Rudy can give us a little bit more clarity on that. But maybe let's just start from a practical point of view from the private sector parties that is in the meeting with us, and just find out, because in reality, Henk is our economist. I understand, and also from the minerals industry, but in reality, transport is not about transport. It is not just about the fact of build it and they will come, or build it and they will use. We are talking here about moving markets, and the end of it, it's essentially about the economy. And about the communities that need to live from these economies. So if we get it wrong in the transport industry, then it affects every single person's livelihood in this country. Henk, what would you say to that?
Absolutely, Christelle. I think what few people realize is that the South African economy is actually a very open trade economy. We depend for 60% of our GDP generation on imports and exports, and a massive proportion, 95% of that, is actually trade in products, goods, which all have to be transported. I think the second important statement to make is that we're actually a landlocked country. Most of the economic activities in Gauteng, and most of mining, if I can add that, is actually further away. So we need to export and import trade a massive proportion of what the whole economy is about, and that's really saying it in two sentences.
In a nutshell, yes. So economy is the important part, and I like this this indication of the fact that we're actually landlocked. We think we have the ports. We've had a lot of discussion about inland ports, but there's a lot of connections that we need to get right. And we're hoping, again, as I said, when Mr. Dix joins, we can find out a little bit about whether we are moving further in making sure that the connecting the different modalities, connecting the different provinces and areas can actually take part. But Unita, from your side, and looking at it from a freight forwarder, the people that actually have to move these goods and connect it between different modalities, where are we struggling? And did we get here overnight? Or has this been coming in for a long time?
Thank you, Christelle. I like what Henk is saying, landlock. I want to refer it to maybe it's land linked, because we need to link to our ports and our modality. But maybe I can start with that. If we look at the logistics network, you've got your air modality, your pipeline, your road, your rail, and your ocean freight, and then in a lesser content, your conveyor belt. So when we look at our logistics network, those modalities needs to work together because they operate in different load, distance, and capacity. And then also, when Henk was talking about our high freight demand, it needs to be customer centric, because you need to make sure that your logistics network address what your customer wants. And when you ask the question, how did we come here? I think we did not, as private sector, were too vocal over the years to say that what is the KPI performance to make sure the logistics network work, and what can we do to make sure that the different linkage in those modalities are well maintained. And that's what we currently experience. Yes, we can blame and shame, and we can go back to say that the infrastructure was not well maintained, the equipment's not been looked after, the rail distortion is happening. But in essence is that we did not understand the linkage, and neither the KPI that's driving the different modalities in the logistics network. And it's unfortunately not that we come here overnight. It was a path probably for the last 12 to 15 years, because we did not understand how it links together. Thank you.
So Philani, then coming back then also from a private sector point of view, so what should we as private sector have done more, or what can we do going into the future to make sure that we are heard, that our voices go into the planning, so that the planning, our products, our connections, what we can deliver can actually get out there at the end of the day, and we can make sure that the economy moves ahead. But it doesn't help because we make all of our plans as companies, and then we just cannot move ahead. Philani, hi, for you. There we are.
Thank you. I was saying, certainly from a rail perspective, I think planning is absolutely critical in terms of ensuring that we are able to service the rail industry as effectively as we should. So in our case, we manufacture turnouts, we supply head-hardened rails, we also manufacture signaling components. All of these are critical to Perway, the infrastructure aspect of rail. And in that regard, a number of the materials are imported into South Africa. So there is that time frame that requires planning in order to make sure that the products are ordered in time, they pass through our extremely congested port systems timeously, that they get to us in order to serve the purpose of being an input into the manufacture of these of the material that we require to supply. Likewise, we need to make sure that in terms of the local products that we also use as inputs into our manufacturing capabilities, that load shedding isn't an issue, because that leads to delays in supply and so on and so forth. So across the entire value chain, from my perspective, resolving the issues of power, resolving the issues of logistics, because even from the perspective of us manufacturing materials, the biggest challenge we in fact have is that of Transnet or PRASA sending a sufficient number of wagons or arranging other modes of transportation to come to our facility to collect the manufactured goods for them to take them to site for installation. So I would say there's the issue of wagons that needs to be resolved urgently. There is the issue which ties into the issue of the logistics to the final sites. There is also the issue of the ports, not only in terms of the congestion of ports, but we require rails in order for us to manufacture turnouts. What has recently happened in South Africa is that the port of Port Elizabeth, which accepted the imports or accepted long rails, 16-meter long rails, which were imported from Austria in the main, is no longer accepting rails. So query how it is that we're going to overhaul our entire rail infrastructure network, the 9 billion rand that is being spoken about as being essential, or that has been requested of Transnet, or that has been raised by the executives at Transnet as the funding that they require in order for them to start dealing with the critical works that are required to restore this network. And for me, the third thing, which is possibly the most important, is the following. There has been significant conversation around, in the rail space at least, there has been significant conversation around operations, around the long-standing locomotives, etc., but very little intentional conversations around and planning around what to do with the network infrastructure itself. There is absolutely no way that we will achieve the operational efficiencies that we require for so long as the infrastructure network is in the condition that it is at this point in time.
So the one is basically not keeping up with the other. I mean, this is what I'm hearing. So it's a linkage issue. It is the different planning stages that is not necessarily linking up. Henk, Unita, and from yourself, Philani, and I'm not sure if Mr. Dix has joined us yet. Nope, I don't see him yet. But let me ask you this. So we always say there's not enough investment. And then when we speak to investors, investors say, no, we will invest if there's good enough projects. So bring the projects to us. So is it an issue in respect of there's not projects? Are they not consistent enough projects? Or so this is now a different pipeline. I'm not talking project pipeline, not physical pipeline, but do we not have the right projects at the right time? People confused, so they don't really know how they're supposed to interact and come and invest. So where are we? So let me start with you, Philani, because you're talking about the rail infrastructure, and I'm sure you must be investing, and you must have companies that want to contribute and build and manufacture these products, and they want to know, so what's the pipeline? Philani, when must we be ready?
We've been ready for many, many years to contribute to the upgrade and maintenance of the rail network. I think one of the critical issues that we tend to shy away from speaking about is the capacity of the respective customers' supply chain capabilities. I think there is a significant logjam there, in the sense that my sense is that there are too many people, which leads to conflicting or slow decision-making. A number of tenders or RFPs or bidding documents are cancelled. The lead time completely flouts Transnet's policies. They're meant to make decisions within 60 days. The decision to award us the turnouts tender, for instance, took almost a year to complete. Now, when you think about the fact that Transnet had not placed an order for the manufacture and supply of turnouts since approximately 2016. On the one hand, you can imagine what that means for the condition of the rail network, given the fact that over 90% of the turnouts that are installed on the South African rail network are VAE, voestalpine's turnouts. And then secondly, when you take into account the fact that there are significant delays in the award of these contracts, the suppliers themselves, the manufacturing industry itself, until this particular contract was awarded, was on its knees, because there is a domino effect that comes with it. Our ability to secure the contract means that the manufacturers of sleepers in South Africa suddenly are able to restart their operations. Suddenly, the manufacturers of turnout sleepers are able to take their businesses out of being mothballed. And so it goes. The manufacturers of rail fasteners are able to restart their machinery, rehire potential employees, rehire people to come and work in order to begin the business of manufacturing or building this local manufacturing capacity that we all say that we want to have. It seems to us, for instance, that it's so much easier for, or we are given the fact that local manufacturing requirements have been so relaxed. There is this anxiety about whether or not there will be this support for the establishment and sustainability of the manufacturing industry in a manner that enables us to become the manufacturing hub for this continent, for the rail industry.
So it's also to do with quality. Henk, from your side, the impact of contract delays, the impact of having the different parties speaking and the different plans coming together at the same time on the economy, are we, I guess to some extent, are we losing it? Have we lost it? Do we need to restart it to some extent? Just to get things to plan come out at the same time so that we can have the consistent interest. And also, as you're the economist, I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about the cost of this. If these, as Polani says, these contracts have been delayed for such a long time, with the Rand weakening our position in respect of being able to go out and borrow money, weakening, it's costing us more. Is this now all in the costing us as the South African taxpayer far more than it should have?
Now, look, I think if I have to sum up what Polani is saying, it is really about the size of the market for these products that are going into the rail network, and for that matter into the ports.
Oh dear.
And so on. So can you, I hope you can hear me still.
Yes, we lost you there for a second. Please carry on.
Yeah. So it is important to understand that, and what you mentioned about Africa and Southern Africa and being the hub, that is actually the important part, I think. It has been a perennial problem in the South African economy that our market is too small to create the scale that you need to be able to compete with other suppliers from the rest of the world. So that is a very important issue. If I may just say something about the impact into mining, we think that the culmination of many of these problems have resulted in the rail TFR not being able to even fulfill their contracted obligations toward the mining companies, and I'm certain to many of the other customers as well, which is not near the design capacity of this infrastructure. And something else that I don't think people realize is that the last time our economy is a multiple size than it was in the 90s, and the last time we really expanded capacity in harbors was Kucha, which was in the 90s. So the economy, to a degree, and I've said earlier how important trade is for us, have virtually outgrown the capacity of the important corridor lines. There have been massive changes in client base and the utilization of certain of the railway lines. I mean, that is absolutely true. And if they're not used, you cannot maintain them. That's a different issue. But our economy is multiple sizes of what it was a decade or two ago, and we have not been keeping up with neither the capacity that the rail line and the harbors can handle, nor the efficiency that we need.
I think the cost effect, and maybe Anita can also expand a little bit on that as freight forwarders. I mean, are we now basically having to foot a much larger cost.
If I may, it's absolutely the best way to transport massive mining product is by rail. There's no doubt about it. And the more we need it, well, the more delays we have, the more uncertainty we have in servicing our markets, and the more we have to go to road, which is really just a way out of the transport dilemma, the higher the cost. And it's in some instances substantial.
Janita, you spoke a little bit earlier when we spoke, you spoke about airside, I'm going to now call it port side and land side. So I guess ocean side and land side, and then air side and land side, connection issues, and how that impacts, that is just not coming together. So maybe if you can maybe expand a little bit for us on that. I think it links to what Pelani is also saying in respect of making sure that the infrastructure in different places are being updated at the same time, so that you can actually have a seamless logistics process taking place.
Yeah, maybe these three concepts that I want to explain to your listeners or your colleagues is that, and Henk touch on them, and then I will come back to the detail, is that when we look at our network, how it was designed over many years of how the different modalities needs to link to each other. So underpinned to the design of the network, you normally have, and that's all the modalities, you have a shared infrastructure, because you need to have a shared infrastructure to reduce the cost. You've got a shared responsibility, and then in that you need to have a shared maintenance structure. And I think we can see that the Zondo Commission over the last 10 years that we did not put in the rightful investment in our equipment. So what happens now, we have very much old equipment in our harbors, and that goes from the marine side. When you look at the helicopters, the tugboats, the way that we bring the vessels from anchorage to berth. Then you go to all our terminals, and specifically in the Durban terminal, you work with straddle carriers. So straddle carriers have a high maintenance component. And normally with the let's say the capacity that we have in Durban, you need to have 108 straddle carriers to split across the water side, which offload the vessels, and then the land terminal, which help with the evacuation of the containers out of the terminal and the containers coming in. Now, we can see that over the last month, 2 months, and that's why the industry is such in cry. They start the morning with about 70 straddle carriers, and as the day continues, round about in the afternoon, you've got 50. So that means it cannot handle the volume, because we work with an old fleet. And similar, if we go to Durban now, to Cape Town, it's the RTGs. It's similar. We need to have 50 there. We start with a good day in the morning, maybe with 20. And as they work, they cannot handle the pace. And then you go down to 15. So what happened? The volume cannot move. And then you've got the trucks that's standing out. And we don't turn that. So all what we say now, the most critical issues is now we need to unlock investment to help us with the port equipment, that we can upgrade the port equipment. Because we can do, and we can say, and we can talk about it, but unless we put in the investment and we upgrade our port equipment to help them to handle those volume throughput, we upgrade our workshops, we get the right spares to help them quickly to look at the equipment, because we all know now we've got old equipment. What can we do? And you probably would say to me, Unita, well, why can't we get new equipment? New equipment with the port speciality is normally around about 18 to 24 months. That's going to take a long time before we get the new equipment. So we from private sector is probably very pragmatic to say that let we help and let we get the equipment, because with the design, and probably that's also a different concept, is that when we talk about interport and intraport competition, people get very nervous, because why do you want competition and what do you want to do that? But we believe the moment that you start splitting the operations between the water side, the terminal, in the evacuation, and you have transparent KPIs, you bring back an element of what is the real productivity. Can we look at the different competition between different ports? Can we compare that? And I think that's what business love to do, because we do comparison, and that brings trust and we can verify the data. And that's what we need to work towards, because it's for SA Inc. It's not one party, but it's how do we build SA Inc. in this.
So you spoke now about the ports. You mentioned earlier also that it starts at the port, then it needs to come inland because we are, you said, land linked. If I remember your from land,
Yes.
Heng's landlocked to your land linked. Now you indicated that we also have similar issues on some of the major roads in respect of the truck modality. We know there's issues in respect of trucks going down to Richards Bay. We've heard about that quite often. It's often in the news. Are we dealing with it in other places as well? Is that the only real major congestion issue, or are there other roads where we have similar issues? And Henk, I'm going to come back to you on that one as well.
Yeah, Lida, again, is that when you look at the ocean modality, it works with schedules. So the shipping lines come in at Anchorage, they come in Perth, and they cannot be a very long time at Anchorage or at Perth. So that means it's a very much, they push or they pull the cargo to the ports. And now the rail modality cannot move the bulk cargo. We fall back to the road modality. The road modality are pushed now because the cargo owners understand the schedule and they need to get the cargo at a certain window in the ports. Now, they cannot do it, let's say, on the North Corridor or maybe on the N3 corridor. So what do? They get an alternative and they go to either Mozambique or Walvis Bay. And we can see that now in the trade flows. Mozambique, the N4 corridor, handled about 1,800 trucks a day. And it wasn't designed to handle that. It was designed to handle 600 trucks a day. So you can see now we're coming back to reality. We've got long queues. The drivers had fatigue. They start skipping the law enforcement rules because they get very frustrated because they cannot move the cargo. And I think that's what we get because we don't have an imbalanced network modality where each modality plays rightful role. And that's why we're very behind the rail reform to look at how can we look and bring back the rail modality to its rightful place.
Hey, from your side, Palani, and I think we're now going back to rail, and I think the connectivity on rail and different, so not just at the ports, we've spoken about the port rail, but right through the country. We've had discussions about the use of private sector, of essentially taking mini routes and putting that out to the private sector. Can this work? How long do you think it'll take for us to be able to get to that kind of aspect? And you spoke about, it's not just about the railway stock, it is about the infrastructure. So, we cannot move things until we have the infrastructure. So if you can maybe just comment a little bit on that.
Well, I think our South African railway reforms that are embedded in a white paper that was published a year and a half ago, maybe two, is an excellent piece of work. It talks to effectively the African rail renaissance, which if we all put our shoulders to the wheel, the public sector as well as the private sector, hand in glove, I think we can achieve miracles, and we can restore that the rail industry to its rightful place. Because I would argue that rail, in fact, is central to the other modalities of transportation, especially given the fact that we mine and we export as much as we do. Now, the two observations I'd make, or two comments I'd make, are that with respect to private sector participation, the reforms in fact provide for a third-party access, which effectively allows for third-party operators to start operating on the line. A lot of work has gone into that from a government point of view. There is the national economic regulator, I think, is yet to be appointed, although there is a temporary there is an interim structure that has been put in place while that appointment process is being finalized. And the whole intention there, what is stopping the process from being implemented in full, is that the whole issue around tariffs, which need to be fairly implemented for everyone, so that Transnet doesn't get fairer rates or cheaper rates than anybody else who uses that network. I think that's on the one hand. So I am particularly excited about the fact that in the next year we will see the private sector play an increasing role in terms of the operations of rolling stock on the rail network. It still leaves that huge question mark around what we do with respect to the upgrade and maintenance of the infrastructure itself. The other part, the second observation for me is the fact that we need to start working far closer as between the private sector and the public sector in starting to realize these opportunities. So one of the things that Transnet has done is that they have put out some RFPs, certainly with respect to the NAT core line, so that the private sector gets, I think it's a 20 to 30-year concession, in terms of which it is responsible for the upgrade and maintenance of that line from an infrastructural point of view, but that they also get to operate that line. So I think we're going to start seeing more and more of these concession type structures that enable us to actually begin to grow our economy in a meaningful way.
Fantastic, thanks, Philani. So Rudy Dix has joined us. So Rudy, we've been having a nice private sector chat here, and now we're waiting for you to come in and answer.
I'm quite excited listening to what everyone is saying, and I'm really sorry, Christel, for joining later. I did explain to Shannon.
No problem. No problem.
We could carry along. Of a very important meeting. Thanks. Anyway.
But yes. It's actually at a very good point that you're joining now, because we sort of like spoken about the fact that there's different modalities, that there are a lot of requirements that at this stage, we're sitting at a point of there's so much that needs to be done. The question is what comes first. How do we achieve all of this? In the end, it is about the economy. And it is not about these different aspects. I think Janita calls it SA Inc. So we're looking at SA Inc. and its people. So maybe, Rudy, if you can maybe just talk to us a little bit about the National Logistics Crisis Council. I mean, whenever you hear the word crisis, you think, oh, okay, we know we were in trouble, but is it so bad? But yes, it obviously is if it needs a crisis council. The linkages between the NLCC, obviously Operation Vulindlela, looking at the crisis council around power and electricity, because it doesn't necessarily all just come on its own. Logistics needs that also to move. But what is going to come first? I mean, is that part of what the NLCC is doing?
Absolutely. And maybe Christel, sorry, I thought you had finished. My apologies.
No, I'm done.
So if I would say, what is the most important thing right now? Right? I mean, I think it's all that I got the last part of Philani and a little bit of Juanita. But I think if it is that one says, what is it that we need to do right now? And in the freight logistics roadmap, and I know some of you have seen copies of it because it had unfortunately leaked, it is to improve the operational performance of Transnet. That is the most fundamental thing right now. We need to get the volumes up. We need to address some of the inefficiency in the system. We need to get the procurement right. We need to ensure we get the spare parts and maintenance. We need to ensure that we get that rolling stock onto the lines. But that doesn't put it in a sequential order, I would say, right? So for me, I think Polani's point about a whole set of other reforms separating infrastructure and operations, both in port and rail, are also fundamental. So we have to do this all in tandem, right? So it's not one step first and then the next step. And at that same time, as we separate infrastructure and sorry. Okay, just let me close this. I'm sorry, it's still my old meeting wanting me back again. Sorry about that. So as we separate that, it's quite important for us to be able to ensure that, as I've said on many occasions, that the infrastructure will remain within state control and state hands. But it has to be separated, as Polani talks. Because if we're talking about an open access system, we mean non-discriminatory access, we mean non-discriminatory pricing, we mean asymmetrical information sharing, and this is also very, very important. And therefore, competition is quite important to pick up efficiencies. And we see that quite quickly, even when we introduce the kind of reforms in the electricity space. When we opened up private sector embedded generation, we've massively seen an uptick in applications. I mean, right now, we, for example, are tracking about 12 gigawatts of electricity. So we think that if we're able to do the reforms quite quickly and get into competition and get private sector into the operational space that is there, it's competing with Transnet, so Transnet would have to bring down its prices. But also, generally speaking, there's enough pie there for private sector participation without impacting on the kind of customers that are there for Transnet. And I think this is the really what I think is going to be important. So your second part of the question would be, I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, it is a crisis. We've accepted that. And I think it's important that where we have fundamentally sectors that impact on growth, and the two biggest constraints on growth, the first, which is the most important, is energy. You can't do anything without energy. Right. And therefore, of course, when the president announced the Energy Action Plan during the course of last year, we set up the National Energy Crisis Committee. I think we made an immense amount of progress. And I say that with a bit of caution, right? Because people say, what sort of progress? We still have load shedding. But I think it's important for us to be able to see that the direction that we've taken, the interventions that we've made, are not necessarily immediate. They come into effect when we took decisions last year, for example, around private sector embedded generation. Those decisions are going to be affected as more of private generation comes onto stream and they're able to ease on the grid. The interventions of getting private sector support for Kusile, for example, and having both those units coming 2 months earlier than expected is quite important.
Yeah.
So NLCC, precisely on the same form, we have to accept the crisis. We have to work with the private sector. We have to get interventions going. And for us, there are two areas that I think are fundamental that the NLCC will look at. Broadly speaking, it's the immediate turnaround on operational performance that is required and the long-term reform that is required for both rail and ports. And that's important in creating a competitive space.
Okay, so we're looking at therefore, Polani, I do see your hand is up as well, and I do also just want to say to everybody that is the participants that I do see your questions. I'm going to come to them now as well. So we're looking at essentially creating competitions in operations and in infrastructure and maintenance. So it's going to be a combination. It's not just in one part. Is that what you're saying?
No.
Okay.
I mean, what you want to do is think of the network, and again, the network is ours, right? I didn't draw the correlation with transmission. It's the same. So the actual infrastructure, the rail lines, the overhead cables, the non-movable assets, those should remain in government control. And what we need to do, of course, is create a separate entity, because you can't have Transnet being the referee and the player. And I think that's Polani's point early on. So you can't have Transnet. So for example, in establishing the infrastructure manager for rail, in our roadmap, we argue quite clearly that it should not be in TFR. So even as it moves from being a division to a subsidiary, and then, of course, fully outside of Transnet to create a genuine competition within the space, we've already recommended to the board and Transnet that the infrastructure manager that is intended to be established by the end of October should be a division in Transnet, not in TFR. So it creates that bit of space between TFR and itself, right? And that's quite important. The next phase is creating a subsidiary. The next phase, years later, would be independent. What we want to see is competition in the operation space. So access to branch lines, access to the network, access to the port space, TPT, competing with TPT, for example, if that's the case. And of course, again, if one talks about rolling stock, Pulani, of course, and a company have been quite important players. There are many others that are in the rolling stock space. But certainly looking at it from that kind of point of view, rolling stock is going to become an important part of the reform program. And as we open up the space, more and more private sector companies, small scale, medium scale, who don't have deep pockets to buy 250 million rand train set that is required, for example, with all its wagons and components for maintenance, would have to lease. And so I think this is part of the conversation around how we can set up a partnership between Transnet, who has most of the rolling stock, and the private sector, so that we're able to ensure that rolling stock is not an impediment when there are private players who want to access the line, that they are easily able to access rolling stock, lease it or purchase it, or through other forms of models that are there to be able to access it so they can actually compete. And I think that's really what we're looking at. Separation of infrastructure, operations, infrastructure remains with it. And that's why TNPA, the fundamental reform around TNPA, is so important. Because if you recall, TNPA is now part of its process is, of course, is appointing a new board, a permanent board. And that's the most important step of creating that separation of infrastructure between TNPA and TPT. Again, we'll do the same thing when we launch and we finally set up the infrastructure manager for rail as well.
Okay, so Pulani, you took your hand down, so I'm not sure if you still have a question, but I'd like to then. You do, okay. So, but I'd like to put one of the questions that came from the panelists is, okay, and Rudy, you speak about, okay, there's going to be separation. We're going to have these new entities to make sure that Transnet is not sitting basically on both sides making decisions. But we already have many players. So it is not just about rail and it's not just about ports. It's also about the linkages from rail to roads and rail to, so if we don't get that right, then, whatever we do with rail also doesn't matter. So Pulani, I don't know if your question links with that. I'd like to, if you want to go first, in respect of how do we make sure that we have those linkages, and then Rudy, I'll come back to you just to say, okay, then how do we bring all these parties together? And we're not just talking about national entities, we're also talking about municipalities here as well, that is going to be affected. So Pulani, go for it.
I think I have a comment in response to what Rudy has shared with us, and then a question to Rudy as well. I think my comment really is with respect to the issue of vertical separation, where you're separating the operations from infrastructure. What is of slight concern to me is whether or not there is a clear business case that has been established for vertical separation, whether there is a revenue model for Transnet, whether there has been a sound risk assessment, as well as a migration plan, because without a migration plan, it may just fall flat on its face. We still have time because apparently, the separation will only happen effectively in the context of this infrastructure manager towards the end of this month. It's important that this is done in a way that improves volumes and system efficiency, and that we don't rush into it without granular level planning. And, for me, one of the things is we're great at putting plans together, but query how granular we become in terms of pulling together those plans. So that's my observation on your comments around vertical separation. Then the question from me is with respect to the plan that you've put together for turning things around as quickly as possible. This short-term plan for me I'm a bit curious about it, because at the end of the day, and certainly insofar as the infrastructure of the network is concerned, I mentioned earlier that a number of the parts that make up the products or material that need to be manufactured in South Africa are imported from elsewhere. This takes time. We have a port system that is not efficient at the moment, so it takes even longer. In addition to that, we have a Port Elizabeth port that used to accept long rails, 60-meter long rails, which is no longer accepting rails being imported into South Africa, and is only dealing with the export of manganese. So query in the context of the planning, I'd call it a 6-month action plan, whether these factors have been taken into account and what it is that is going to be done to mitigate them. And possibly most importantly, where is the private sector? Where is the per-way industry in sitting and planning alongside Transnet, alongside the government, in trying to make sure that what we say we want to do, we are actually able to do, because all of the different stakeholders come together with their different strengths and are able to ensure that the outcome is what we envisage.
I think you're muted, Christel. You muted, Christel?
Mute. Sorry. My apologies, I'm muted. So you've got a very long question, but I think just bringing it down to very clear points is, as said by one of the panelists, is there a plan of who's going to do what by when? And I think therefore Polani's question of, is it being brought to granular basis? And how do we link these various entities as well in government, and make sure that it works well as then private sector in
No, I'll just quickly, because I don't think I want to spend too much time. I think Polani is familiar with the work that we're doing with the private sector and with Henk in particular. But Polani, on your first comments, yes, I think there's a significant amount of work that has been done since last year in Transnet on the separation process, and ensuring that we deal with a whole set of others, debt risk, governance issues around shareholder, issues around transfer of staff, issues around making sure that there's a continuous providing the services, and issues around funding. So I think that the one thing that has happened in our engagements with Transnet and the Transnet board, and even the new board, has been on the commitment on the separation and the vertical, issues around the vertical integration, right? And I'm fairly confident that we have it in hand. We're working across government, and I think that's quite nice. So we have the asset and liability management as part of this process. We have DOT as part of the policy, the shareholders there. The board is also quite involved. And I think this is what is quite nice. So we had obviously, as part of the consultation process, shared the roadmap that is quite detailed on specific timeframes, quite granular on the timeframes that are required for us to be able to meet both the turnaround on operational performance, and specifically around some of the reform stuff that are going to be quite critical to allow for private sector participation in the operations of both rail and port. And as I understand, and the board has not communicated this to us, but the board is quite happy that the roadmap speaks quite a lot to their turnaround strategy. And I think that's quite useful for us to be able to be on the same page. And for me, that's quite critical. The last point that I want to make is that we set up the National Logistics Crisis Committee. There are 8 work streams that are there. The first work stream is precisely the work stream on improving operational performance. Now, remember the NLCC, unlike NECOM, which was initially set up then, the NLCC, its starting point was on a collaborative arrangement with business. And in fact, when we set up the operational performance, we'd agreed with the Minerals Council, and Henk was here, on the corridor recovery teams, the 4 or the 5 corridor recovery teams. That's the Northern Corridor, the coal line, the general freight, the chrome magnetite, the manganese, and the iron ore one. that we would collapse the work that has already been done. So we didn't want to duplicate, neither did we want to kind of jump ahead, but we collapsed the work that is already part of a partnership between the work of the Minerals Council and their individual members specifically who are important and who contribute to the running of the ore bodies from pit to port. We collapse it into the NLCC. So we've successfully done that. On each and every one of those corridors, there's a corridor team that is working on it, right? And that's specifically from the private sector, both for rail and ports, quite a bit of experienced people. We've gotten particular experts, engineers in that is quite critical. The corridor teams, and this is again very important, and I want to emphasize this, because at the end of the day, although we can collaborate, although we can have OV and we can have the presidency, DOT, and private sector all collaborating, the responsibility of implementing that turnaround plan or the roadmap or whatever we agree to in NLCC remains the responsibility of the senior most leadership in transit, the executive management and the EMs that are there. And I think that's quite important. So we've built that, we had to bake that in. And the way we baked that in was for the corridor managers or the EMs to take responsibility for managing this and for having an open process to allow us to be able to input and look at data from a very, very granular level. So I'm fairly confident, Pulani and Christelle, that the way that we set it up, the way we baked it into the system, learning from the corridor recovery teams that was set up by the Minerals Council and Transnet, that we are able to get it going. We don't have time, right? So we don't have a year like we have with Eskom. Year is about getting the volumes up, getting the functions of the lines up, making sure that we address some of the maintenance issues, making sure that we address cable theft, making sure that we deal with spare parts that are going to be quite critical. Spare parts like batteries, for example, signaling systems that would have to be invested in and done. So this is quite critical, and I'm quite confident that the team from B4SA, Business for South Africa, has brought in quite an adequate set of skill sets and expertise to be able to help us to support Transnet eventually to be able to implement this at the end of the day. Sorry for that long one.
Okay. Right. No. Thanks, Rudy. So maybe I want to get a little bit to some of the other questions from the panelists as well. So Renette, one of the things that we did discuss when we met on Monday what was around, we've had a lot of interaction now about what is happening within South Africa, what is happening with the NLCC. But obviously, a lot of what we link to is the rest of Africa, both from our road system and other transport systems, and whether we're using the trade possibilities well enough in respect of the Africa Trade Agreement. So Renette, maybe from your side as a freight forwarder, do you see that as important? I know that there are African policies being put in place. Are we playing our part? Are we benefiting or planning to benefit? Sorry,
Can
Renette.
I go, or do you want Renette to go? I think she's muted.
Oh, sorry, not Renette. My apology, Unita.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
My apologies.
No, that's fine. I just want to come. Let's say if we look at the Africa Free Continental Trade Area, is that we as South Africa definitely want to play in that, because I think we're part of the continent and we want to make sure that we can open export and import opportunities. But I think, as you know, in trade, there's two things. You've got your tariff barriers to say that, okay, let's protect some of the commodities, and we have then a duty rate, and then you've got your non-tariff barriers. And I think that's what we grapple with in the logistics industry. There is non-tariff barriers. And if we can classify the non-tariff barriers, it goes very much like, how can I cross a border? And can you recognize my customs declaration? And do you view my risk that I see in the country of origin to the country of destination in the same way? And if you look at the risk, and let's say you identify it's a high-risk cargo, how quickly can you inspect it? How quickly can you give me a message, and how quickly it can flow back to say that this cargo is good and it can move? So I think that's where we found ourselves in the logistics space, that the land borders are not well coordinated. But it's not that there's not a light in the tunnel. I think the World Customs Organization is doing great work to say that how can we align the different customs authorities, and also maybe how we can bring in the other government agencies. And I think maybe we haven't perfected yet, because we have the BMA in South Africa, and they try to bring all the other government agencies on the land border and then the ports together. But I think if we can, my simple answer, if we can reduce some of the non-tariff barriers, then we can create a way where we can escalate it in the Africa Agreement or the Africa Union. That will be helpful. And then we need to get a level understanding of what is trade facilitation, because I think in different places they have different definition, but we need to say that trade facilitation is a seamless flow of low-risk cargo. And then the last one, I think what we want to do is that we need to bring in the AEO concept. And the AEO concept is not for multinationals, it's for everyone to say that I recognize you because you are a legitimate trader and you take responsibility to work well in the supply chain. And because you do that, I'm going to open for you a different lane that your cargo can move quicker to the land border. So I think that's more or less just the ideas of our thinking, and it is possible. And I think South Africa can take the lead because our customs authority is well positioned. They do work with technology. We just, from a business point of view, need to help as well and take it further and speak to our business partners. Thank you.
Partners. So then, Henk, maybe a question for you, and Rudy, you can maybe just come in on whether the NLCC has dealt with this issue. You've mentioned security and obviously making sure that when we maintain whatever we maintain, it is well kept. How important is the local community, civil society? So we've talked about interacting with business, Unity South Africa, which is more on the business side, but we see so much at the moment of projects being held up because of either construction mafias in specific areas, or also to some extent transport mafias. Can we get around that? Are we bringing the communities along? Concerns that, if you build something in one community, why is it not happening in my community? That one will maybe get it faster than the other, and how are we getting that through so that we can keep what we have, and it's not coming at more of a cost? So Henk, if you could start, and then because I know from the mining industry it is a very important issue, and then Rudy, if you can just add as well.
Yeah, if I may, remember geographically, most of the mining activity are now taking place in very deep rural areas where we often mostly have local authorities that are dysfunctional. And it's looked upon mining to provide the total solution to a degree, and I'm putting it in extreme terms. And it's not possible. Mining can't take over the local government role. It cannot negotiate amongst communities. That's a massive issue, a problem for us, because the moment you strike a deal with someone or some group, the other groups, exactly as you're saying, the others are coming and saying, but you're not being talking to the right people. So it is a massive problem. Mining can make a massive contribution. I think that is quite important. We had a discussion this morning about Limpopo. The mining wage bill is something like 30% of Limpopo's wage bill that are going to people. In other words, the buying power in that area. And our argument is, as we provide employment, we are saying, please rectify the problems in the local authorities, because the buying power will stay in your area if that's the case. They won't travel to Witbank or to Polokwane or to Pretoria or Johannesburg. They will buy in the area, and everything will the circulation of money in specific areas will make a huge contribution. In many instances, and we've been talking about the rail situation and the actual product, the rail itself. In many instances, the heavy stuff and equipment that mines are using cannot be manufactured. It may be able to service, we may be able to service it in a region, but we cannot manufacture it at scale in a local authority. South Africa mining is about 5% of, if that much, 3 to 4% of world mining. So you cannot imagine a Scandinavian company setting up a production facility in even Polokwane or whatever. But mining can make a massive contribution, and because we look after our people, it's in our interest that they have health facilities, they have clean water, they have sewage facilities, they, as far as possible, have electricity and housing, and it is often when nothing else works and the mine is still operating, the mine becomes the target. It is of great concern, and just recently in the Northern Cape we have been cornered to a degree by local business forums and communities, and the mines basically don't have, apart from their own security, can actually resolve that. We need the cooperation and do cooperate with local authorities. So it is important. We of course are always between two extremes. On the one hand, the local cost, of which uncertainty and this sort of unrest is also a part, and then what's happening with commodity prices. And at the moment, that is of great concern. If that margins are squeezed, then the mining becomes non-profitable. So we are in a sea of poverty often. Are making a contribution, but we can't solve the problem.
The problem.
We need the cooperation. Yeah.
Thanks, Henk. So I guess, Rudy, it comes back to my question in respect of, is there does community as a whole, civil society, I know we can't speak to every single community, but are we bringing them on with us so that we don't create expectations, which then becomes that leads to frustrations, that then leads to issues of that could have been left behind.
Yeah.
The sabotaging, and then also just, we're talking about moving from transport, from road transport back to rail. Is it possible? Have we not gone too far? Or are we saying, listen, we're not talking about current, but we're talking about additional product that we're trying to generate and create, so that we have less of a fight about it, but more of a creating of a bigger pie. Go for it, Rudy.
But let's separate. I like the way that you and Henk have spoken about it, but let's separate, because there's a general challenge on copper cable theft and infrastructure theft, right? And that's syndicated. So those are organized criminal gangs, right, who are doing that. And I think part of the work that we're doing, and it's quite interesting, because I saw on both the NECOM and the NLCC, they still copper cable theft, whether it's Eskom or whether it's Transnet or whether it's one of Henk's members' mines, right? They just do that. And therefore you need to have that coordinated approach across the JCPS cluster, the Justice Prevention Cluster. But I think what we've emphasized in this collaboration is that we need a partnership with the private sector, right? That's absolutely. So what's quite nice, we brought together to deal with the syndications, and I think you've seen some of the smashing of some of these syndications, coal, for example. I think we're slowly getting into the nub of trying to deal with some of the investigations around the organized copper cable theft, particularly for Transnet. We know where the hotspots are. So that's quite important for us. But your part is, what you're saying around communities and communities' frustration around infrastructure being invested and they're not getting jobs. I think that's part of an ongoing strategy. We know this thing around 30% payments and many of the others. I think the distinguishing factor is that there's genuine community issues that we need to address. And part of the strategy is to bring communities on board, and we need to play a leading role. We can't pass the cost simply onto mines, or we can't pass the cost simply onto Transnet or to Eskom or to anybody else, or simply externalize it and say it's not our problem. We have to jointly look at it, and I think government's responsibility to do that. I don't think we're too far on we need to tell you about the the massive security problem that we're having precisely on the roads, because you see the shift from rail to road, right? And so you have massive targeting on logistics system, on freight logistics on the road. At the border posts, on the N3, as you can see, colleagues, I mean, this is organized. And so I don't think we pass it. Again, it's a cost factor, as Henk says, you know. And if we reduce the overall efficiency through logistics, and if rail becomes much more cheaper, which we hope is going to happen quite soon, you'll see bulk commodities, and they have to, man, because they're destroying. I mean, this is the unintended consequences, right? You know, this is the externalization of the cost that the road networks are damaged and destroyed. They have to come back on rail, and we have to find a way to do that. So I don't think it's gone too far. I certainly think there's a lot of what is on road that can still come on. I suppose as many of some of the agri guys are going to say, no, we're going to continue being on road. And it depends again on the efficiency of the rail system and cost, right? And who pays for that cost?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's just talk to, I think one of the questions that was also brought on by a panelist is, so what about municipalities? Are they being, so you talked really about the importance, and I think Henk is indicating you need municipal involvement. UNITA has done that as well in respect of municipal involvement, in respect of some of the aspects. So how much are we involving then municipalities in this entire process? Do we need to involve them more? Do they have the capacity to be able to play, or are they just so busy at the moment? We do know that obviously some of them are also the power providers, etc. At the end of the day, so and there's water provision, and there's other basic infrastructure that has to come from them. So it is important. So yes, so from a municipal point of view, are we playing with them?
I think we have to. I don't think we're doing good enough. I do think that we're having some significant challenges, and that's not new, as you can see with the AG's report on basic services. We have to get and support municipalities where they can. And I think, for example, on water provision or distribution of electricity or simply provision of just general bulk services are going to be quite critical for us. I think it depends on the type of municipality, and also depends on who's in the municipality, where there's a kind of support that's going to be. But we need to do a little bit more around that. I think that's going to be quite critical.
For that. Okay, so we're coming into the end. I think as far as I know, we've touched on as much of the questions as we can. As Shannon indicated, some of the questions we will try and just get some of the panelists to answer specifically. There are some questions that are quite long. I don't think we can deal with the kind of detail here. It probably needs a report by itself. So we will definitely put them, particularly if you've specified a specific person, to them. We will send it on to Mr. Dix and the other panelists as it was specified. But maybe if I can let each of the panelists just finish with a final comment around this issue. We've had a lot of discussion on the NLCC. We've had discussions around the general problem. But I guess my question that I started up with was, what is practical? What can we do practically in a very short, and what is your responsibility from your entity, or what you think you need to undertake and take part in? So I'm going to just say from BDO, I do a lot of infrastructure advisory. I'm working on a number of PPPs at the moment, from airports, etc. And I can certainly see that the need to bring parties together is exceptionally important. The need to understand the reality of the cost of what we're putting forward, and what this will mean on government budgets going forward in the future. I have to make sure that whatever I do, this is very clear to my clients, and to make sure that we understand the total plan and change the plan, because this is very much a moving target at the moment. And I think in order to make sure that whatever we put forward as transaction advisors, that it incorporates everything that is happening consistently and the changes that are taking place. So that is from my side. If we can start Polani, with you. Last comment, commitment.
Polani, you're on mute.
There we go. I was saying that I would like to make a comment and then talk to my commitment. The most important, hello?
We can hear you.
Ah, okay. So for me, the comment that I'd like to make relates to the conversation that we just had regarding organized copper cable theft. And my comment there is that I think it's important to look at the history. You know, historically, the copper cable theft was never in excess of 10 kilometers a month. Today, there are over 100 kilometers per month of copper that's stolen from the cables. And there's probably more than the 100 kilometers, but the 100 is what we're comfortable with. My perspective on that is twofold. First of all, I think that the NLCC has many challenges to deal with, whereas in the context of copper cable theft, I actually think that it's a simple exercise of the security manager at Transnet together with contractors being enabled and emboldened to do the work they need to do to protect the copper over OHTE. And secondly, if the operations were efficient and you saw rolling stock on the network multiplied relative to what it is today, I think that we'd see less copper cable theft. In other words, copper cable theft is a global phenomenon, but a combination of a lack of proper security and a lack of movement on the rail network is what causes it to increase. In terms of what my commitment is, certainly from a turnouts manufacturing and turnouts components perspective is concerned, I think my commitment is one about advocacy. In the context of turnouts, ordinarily, if properly maintained, a turnout should last you in excess of 25 years. In Austria, turnouts last well in excess of 25 to 27 years. In Egypt, turnouts last approximately 7 years. That's a function of a lack of maintenance. And in South Africa, turnouts last on that network for between 2 and 5 years. Again, that's a function of a lack of maintenance. So I think for us as the private sector, we need to be agitating and advocating much more for us to catch up with the backlog of maintenance or upgrading the network that needs to have been done in order to make sure that we get to a point where we start dedicating as much time and attention to the maintenance side of things as to the catch-up exercise that also needs to be done. Thank you.
Now, Christelle,
apologies. Thank you, Junito.
Okay, thank you. I've got I've time to write down my 5 points that I want to articulate. So I think the first thing that we want to do is definitely get an awareness and understanding amongst our colleagues in terms of the linkage and the different modalities. So that's what we will continue doing. Then also we want to learn to mature in the dialogue between private sector and government, because government, when we engage with Transnet or the colleagues, they feel very defensive if we address certain things. And I think on the other side, again, they view us as private sector as very competitive and only profit driven, and we don't look at the community. So I think we definitely want to mature more in how can we talk to each other or dialogue together to get to a solution. Then the chambers we have done, and we look at that because we think the Durban Chamber, Kubega Chamber, and the Cape Town Chamber with the Lowveld Chamber are very important in our corridors, and we have a dedicated effort that we want to link with them. And then the fourth one is that we want to increase our density on our container line, because the design capacity is 100 trains a day. And currently, if we're lucky, we run 3 trains. So we believe if we improve the density on the container line, the cable theft will reduce, because the more trains you run on that line, you will actually reduce the theft. And the last one is that we want to drive excellence in our logistics network. And that might be different concept for different people, but I think if we align in excellence and we work for SA Inc. and we put our personal agendas a bit on the back burner or a bit behind us, I think we can achieve as a nation incredible results. And we're looking forward to good reforms. Thank you.
Amazing for 5 points. Thanks, Janita. Henk?
Yeah, I mean, we are looking forward to what has now been put on the table, and it's given impetus to what the Minerals Council and our members have been really finding for the last 2-3 years, that we had this massive opportunity to earn foreign exchange for the country and of course for the companies and for our people, and we missed some of that. So I don't think people realize the fundamental shifts, Rudy, that is on the table and now, which will have the effect. I just want to say that Janita, to a degree, talks about the top of the pyramid where they do the linkages between us as cargo owners, who are really at the bottom. If you imagine a cone, we are the cargo owners at the bottom, and there are thousands of us, and they are the facilitators in the middle. And there's a lot of appreciation for, and what I've learned from the whole broad supply chain knowledge of how these systems fit together. I don't think, well, me anyway, realized how important it's literally like a pipeline, and if that pipeline is blocked anywhere, then the system doesn't work. So good luck to all of us. I think it's an interesting time.
Thank Rudy. Finally, yourself.
Thanks, Christel. I've got short. I'm just saying I think Henk's point here is quite important. I'm quite happy to see, because I can't say impressed unless we start seeing those changes, right? And the impact felt. But I'm quite impressed that both between government, private sector, and even other social partners, that we're able to collaborate and work together, and specifically problem solving. That's the nicest thing, right? I mean, granularity about problem solving, this issue, that issue, but still having a medium to long-term vision about what needs to happen as we fix those problems along the way. So I'm quite excited about that. No, the roadmap is not for public consumption. You'll get it when we tell you it's for public consumption. But for those who have it, I'm sure they managed to find it. And I think, Pulani, don't laugh.
I'm happy to share.
But I think the feedback that we've received so far from an engagement both with business, and we'll be engaging with Labour on Friday also, has been quite positive around the approach that we've taken for implementation of the roadmap. And I do think that that's where it's important to get an alignment between ourselves in government, to get an alignment with Transnet, and to get an alignment with business. That's a recipe for massive positivity and for us to be able to fix the crisis that we support.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panelists. And Shannon, I'm handing back to yourself.
Thanks so much, Christel. That brings us to the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank our facilitator, Christel Groman, for enabling a robust and engaging discussion. I certainly learned a lot in this one. Thank you also to our panelists, Rudy Dix from the Project Management Office in the Private Office of the South African President, Pulani Chabalala Kingston from Woest-Alpine VAE South Africa, Dr. Juanita Marer from the Southern Africa Association of Freight Forwarders, and Henk Langenhoven from Minerals Council South Africa. A big thank you to our sponsors, BDO Advisory Services, Woest-Alpine VAE South Africa, University of Johannesburg, Nale Technologies, and Scania for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion on the transport crisis and ways, hopefully, of overcoming South Africa's poor rail and logistics performance. Our next webinar takes place on the 15th of November at 2 p.m. and will focus on ESG in mining, where a panel will unpack the ESG environment in South Africa. I'll share the link soon. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course, and if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you everyone for your time, and goodbye.